Kelvin Gregorio is the Director of Learning Services at St. Joseph Preparatory School in Philadelphia, where he works with teachers, students, and administrators to improve student outcomes. Additionally, Kelvin is a PhD candidate in the Educational Psychology Doctoral Program at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, where he studies retrieval practice and self-regulated learning in adolescents. TETC, let's welcome together Kelvin Gregorio.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Yeah, I can hear you. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for being here. We look forward to having you impact us with what you guys have been doing with FLINT AI. And you have the floor. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm waiting for my screen to appear. I don't see it in the Teams app. Can you see my title screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh, great. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to just look at my screen here and look at my presentation. So if at any point you're trying to get my attention, feel free to just jump in on the audio. Thank you very much for having me. Good morning from Philadelphia. My name is Kevin Gregorio. I will be presenting on FLINT and a topic that I'm fascinated in that I call self-regulated learning, along with many others. I'll introduce that a little more formally in a moment, but before then, as I said, my name is Kevin Gregorio. I'm the Director of Learning Services at St. Joe's Prep, private Jesuit high school in Philadelphia. I came to this topic of self-regulated learning, through my PhD program in educational psychology. And I'm really interested in teaching students how to learn better and more autonomously. That would be the goal. I teach a doctoral level course on the psychology of teaching. I have a podcast where I interview experts in this field in particular, and I'm currently working on a book with a few researchers on executive function intervention systems. There's a number of sources I will reference throughout this presentation. I think the most important ones are highlighted there, but between all five, if you're interested at all, you really can't go wrong. And all five would be a really good introduction to this topic. I'm going to first introduce what is referred to as the testing effect and then retrieval practice. I'll talk a little bit in broad strokes about what we know about those things and what I think is most relevant to my work with AI and FLINT. I'll sort of introduce some questions that are still in the field. And then I'm going to layer in what I think AI brings to answering some of those questions. And then in particular, what I think FLINT adds on top of that. The testing effect, please don't be distracted by all this information, but the testing effect really refers to the finding that when you give students a test, they retain more information over time than if you simply give them the same amount of time to study passively on their own. Tests are more effective study and learning tools than students' default study strategies is also sort of another finding within the testing effect. And anytime that I refer to the testing effect, I'm really referring to this phenomenon that tests are simply or not simply assessments of learning, but they themselves can become events where learning takes place. And moreover, they're better learning events than students' default study strategies. Retrieval practice, on the other hand, is sort of an evolution of the testing effect. And again, this becomes sort of the foundation with which I interact with AI and become really excited about the hope of AI and FLINT in particular. So retrieval practice refers to sort of an evolution in the research of the testing effect. And it really refers to the fact that if you get students to recall and manipulate information from memory, like they would on a test or a quiz, it actually yields the same effect as the testing effect. So it also lends itself to long-term retention and increasingly so over time, compared to other approaches to learning and studying. I think what's really important to stress about this point, this distinction between the testing effect and retrieval, is that retrieval doesn't have to look or even feel like a test or a quiz. While the testing effect obviously refers to a more formal assessment, retrieval refers to the replication of this phenomenon, but in a much more casual environment. So you could get the retrieval effect through a conversation with the student where the student just doesn't have access to their notes and they have to sort of recall things from memory. You could put a student at the board for 5 minutes and have them present on what they learned in trigonometry. That would yield the retrieval effect. You could have them sort of role play. Again, what is really important is that they're doing this without notes, prompts, or cues, or anything that would sort of trigger prior learning. One of the tributaries or sort of alleyways of research that comes into and out of this topic that I think is most important here is something referred to as retrieval effort. And this really refers to the difficulty of the retrieval practice itself. So whether or not I put a student at the board or I have them, sit in front of a blank piece of paper and tell me everything that's going to be on the French test on Friday, there's obviously a spectrum of difficulty. A fill in the blank test is going to be slightly easier than a short answer, which is going to be easier still than sitting in front of a blank piece of paper and from first principles having to produce what's going to be on the test. Interestingly, when I talk to students, and I'm looking at this image now, when I talk to students about this, the physical analogy is really convenient. Working at an all-boys school, it never fails, it seems, to work to get students to think about, if we were to go to the gym and I were to say, I really want a good workout, if I were to do 10 repetitions, for example, of something really easily and say, okay, thanks for a great workout, I'm good. I always ask students what they would do, and their instinct is to say, no, hold on, you have to do more. And when I sort of press them, they're like, well, you need to put more weight on, you need to do more reps. And when I press them even further and sort of ask, well, like, what exactly are you looking for? When do you know I've gotten a good exercise or a good workout? They'll say things like, you're kind of looking to get into that zone or that sweet spot or that place where it's just hard enough. And so it reflects this sort of thought experiment, reflects kind of a robust instinct for students physically to know where this like zone of proximal development or like this optimally difficult or this optimally desirable difficulty is for physical workouts. However, when you sort of then move that into the classroom, they have really no such instinct. Their idea of like what a good workout is in algebra or what a good practice or study session is in any other class is far less robust and nuanced. But really the analogy is the same. I really want you to find that so-called sweet spot, and getting students to think about that is a tremendous challenge. When I talk to teachers about this, I highlight 5 principles of retrieval. The first, perhaps the most important, is that retrieval simply works and it facilitates long-term retention. And the second, in relation to teachers, is that students won't choose this on their own. Far and away, they tend not to. They tend not to choose this on their own precisely because of why it works. It sort of works because it's challenging them. That challenge seems to lend itself to retention neuropsychologically. But then because it's challenging, students opt not to do it, and they choose far easier, less stressful study techniques and learning experiences. But just because students won't choose it on their own, it doesn't mean we can't do something about it. Fortunately, and this is number 3, teachers can implement this in the classroom, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, like I said, or even feel like a test. This could be a series of exercises where students are sort of very intentionally deprived of certain notes, prompts, and cues that facilitate long-term retention through retrieval exercises. And then again, in relation to my work with teachers, I often highlight that there's a whole host of second-order effects here when we do retrieval on a regular basis that I think teachers would really appreciate. And the first is that retrieval increases engagement and participation, according to many studies, and it also, contrary to what some teachers might fear, implementing retrieval into the classroom, consistent use decreases test anxiety over time. I know this is sort of an overwhelming slide. I want us to just first separate A and B from C. Look at A and B for a second. A refers to, if you can see my mouse, questions on the final test that use the same language as the pre-test for the retrieval practice or for the study session. So if a student was studying a handout or a study guide, it would have some of the same language as the test. In the case of B here, the language is not the same, in that in order to do well on the test, you would have to infer from the study materials or from the practice test. In both cases, in A and B, retrieval practice outperforms the other study strategies. What's interesting in relation to C here is that this fancy term, metacognitive predictions, it's simply what students think works. They rate it almost exactly wrong, where retrieval outperforms every other study approach on offer here in this study. They rate that as the lowest. And again, there's all sorts of interesting conversations about how students perceive difficulty in the classroom versus, on the football field or in the weight room. There's one paper in particular by two prominent researchers in this field who happen to have the same last name, that I think encapsulates a lot of the principles that I'm talking about here. It's making things hard on yourself, but in a good way, creating desirable difficulties to enhance learning. I'm just going to push this point a little bit further here with some prevalence data. It turns out that the vast majority of undergraduate students tend to not endorse self-testing or retrieval practice. But interestingly, students that are sort of further along in education, so in med school or in law school, and even more so at more prestigious institutions, tend to endorse retrieval and testing a little higher, which suggests at least that this is something that can be taught. And moreover, it could be sort of a culture that's taught that these are things that we want to head towards, these challenging ourselves on our own to facilitate long-term retention. Furthermore, when we think about implementing retrieval in the classroom, there's a ton of research on the different modalities that work, and it really isn't very limiting. There's a number of modalities that seem to, when controlled for limiting prompts and cues, that is information that's going to trigger memory for students. There are a number of modalities that teachers can use that facilitate long-term retention, and the retrieval effect, excuse me. But there are a few problems. It's really difficult to get students to use this on their own. So even though we can use class time and explore all those different modalities and make it even less formal in the case of retrieval practice as opposed to the testing effect, even though we can do that, it would obviously be better for student success if we could get students to go home and do this on their own. However, progress on these interventions designed precisely to get students to use retrieval on their own has been, and I say this as someone who's designing one for his dissertation, it's been really challenging. And there's a number of prominent researchers in the field that have struggled to sort of bridge what they call that no-do gap, from knowing that retrieval is the right thing to do, that it's going to beget success and long-term retention, et cetera. Going from that knowledge to actually that action and change in behavior seems to be an enormously wide gulf. One that I think AI and FLINT in particular, in really interesting ways, actually bridges. And so before we enter in AI, if I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, well, what would be sort of like the ideal retrieval situation? It would include these things. First, it would include individualized retrieval efforts with responsive feedback. So where a test is good at creating some sort of testing or retrieval effect, it doesn't challenge you back or sort of respond to what you're writing in real time, the way that a conversation, as I'll introduce in moments, the way that certain AI chatbots might. But in an ideal state, it would sort of push the learning a little further based on what the student says. It would also, to that point, sort of be optimized for difficulty and accuracy. So depending on what different students say, the sort of retrieval practice would ideally meet them at different spots, as opposed to a test as sort of, one line across the board of difficulty. It would be adjustable and it would be on demand, where, certain practice tests and other retrieval practices aren't always available to students. And the ones that are available to them are even more difficult in the setup and less likely for students to choose. And again, in an ideal state, some sort of retrieval practice would close that no-do gap and actually get students to do this on their own. Excuse me. And so it was with all of that sort of in my head that I started to play around with ChatGPT, I guess, maybe 2 years ago. And then, of course, I bring that experience into my experience with FLINT. But first, sort of starting with AI, you can use AI for self-testing and retrieval. So if you look at this sort of example here, Chat, can you quiz me on the testing effect of retrieval? It will produce a bunch of questions. And so the testing effect could theoretically happen in AI. And furthermore, you can actually make this less like a test or quiz. And for example, I say, can you make the quiz more conversational? And it, of course, absolutely says, hey, let's talk about the testing effect. Have you heard about the testing effect before? What do you know? And this would be sort of closer to those first 2 bullet points of that sort of holy grail of retrieval, where it would be responding to my retrieval attempt and meeting me, hopefully, at this sort of desirable difficulty level where I was. So no matter how good or bad my answer is, it should respond accordingly. And if it doesn't, I could sort of tweak that. There are a number of problems. Sorry, let me jump back. There are a number of problems with that. Let's imagine I'm a teacher. I'm sitting in front of 20 students. I don't really know what each of them are doing. And so I may not be able to coach all the students on, hey, this is how you should be interacting with the chatbot. Excuse me. If a student isn't sort of trained, 1, in its interaction with AI, or 2, in the ability to sort of find that sweet spot of desirable difficulty, that's a lot of coaching that's sort of required in front of me. And so I don't have that centralized oversight. I'm going to have to be going from desk to desk, talking to those students. There may be a level of education and perhaps some classes in particular that lend themselves to this. I don't think it's a waste of time at all. It's just suboptimal, especially in that decentralized component. And so while I may be able to create certain chatbots on ChatGPT, again, even their interaction with those sort of custom tailored chatbots is going to be suboptimal in my ability to review it. And so what would be ideal would be the ability to sort of disseminate retrieval and then in a centralized location, go through it, see how students are doing, and then react as the sort of expert in the room. Which I hope doesn't sound like I'm setting this up too much, but which was one of the things that really excited me about FLINT when I first discovered it, was my ability to custom create these certain chatbots. And I was able to test this out in a number of different classrooms that I myself taught in English 3 high school class, and then in a study skills and executive functioning class with freshmen. And then as I sort of started to shop this around with teachers, I realized that, oh my gosh, this could work in physics, this could work in Latin. I can see this working in Spanish. And so more and more, I was sort of getting more data on how this could be implemented, again, to create what I think is the optimal learning experience, which is namely retrieval practice. And so if you could sort of just unpack, I know that there's a new user interface, but this was the first one that I really fell in love with FLINT on. I can create these chatbots that are customizable in their ability to render an exercise into retrieval practice, and the student has a conversation based on the prompts that I create. There's also a number of settings that I can manipulate. And then perhaps most exciting for me, there's these levels of analyses where the students get feedback, which I think is brilliant. I've played a lot with that and been really impressed. But that feedback that each student gets disseminated or gets back sort of gets filtered and comes back through into a centralized location where I can see whole class trends of strengths and weaknesses and things that they need to work on that I, again, can respond to. One of the things that got added at some point was this sort of helpfulness level. And I sort of look at this like this, you can sort of adjust the retrieval difficulty. So from no helpfulness, which would just be sort of strictly questions, the retrieval difficulty would be higher. And on the full helpfulness, it would be more explanatory, and the retrieval difficulty would be lower. What's important is that is hitting where students need. So if you give them a blank piece of paper, if they really couldn't produce very much, then the full helpfulness would probably be optimal for that student. As they became more familiar with the content, we would be shifting that over to none. One of the things that really impressed me, again, if you could go back in your mind and sort of picture that the holy grail of retrieval slide, was this friendly AI chatbot. Again, it feels and looks a lot like ChatGPT in maybe its setup, but it allows the teachers and administrators to see exactly what students are doing. And because it allows that, you can then coach them to use it more effectively. And so I want to introduce one student in particular. Matt is a freshman, or was a freshman. At the time that I started working with Matt, he was failing, I think, about 4 classes. And you can see I was working with him in my study skills class, and I was giving him a bunch of practice that I thought would help him think about school differently. But the whole time I was like, hey, I would love for you to play around with using this to create retrieval on your own. And you could see within the first month, he started to venture into that and did this with a physics study session. And this was a screen capture of his first interaction with the chatbot. First, he asked for help on his physics test, and the answer was really explanatory. But then I could kind of coach him because I saw this happening in real time. I could coach him and say, hey, let's steer towards active study strategies. Let's steer towards retrieval. Can you ask it to quiz you? That's what he asks, and this is what he gets, which is amazing. What is even cooler is that you can notice that the sort of prescribed exercises that I give Matt starts to space out. And more, Matt is using this on his own. He's doing this not only for physics, but also for Latin, another class that he was struggling in. And then at a certain point, Matt just sort of runs away with it. And he's using and talking about FLINT all the time. And I don't know if this is unique to him, but he was an athlete. And a lot of those analogies about sort of getting more extra practice and more reps and that sort of thing, talking about some of the brain science that I thought these exercises facilitated, really hit with Matt and a number of other students. But I think Matt's sort of screen does the most to exemplify how retrieval practice and self-regulated learning, him opting to do this on his own, sort of took over time. And so when I go back to those slides and I say, well, it's really difficult to get students to use retrieval on their own. We can use class time, but obviously, ideally, we would want them to do it on their own. It's really hard to bridge that no-do gap. These are all things in my experience that FLINT was able to do in isolated cases, but there's really no reason for me to, it's only because those are the students for whom I tried to do this. And so one of the things I'm really excited to do this year is try to get larger groups of students and teachers together to facilitate this and track this over time. I think I'm a little unaware of the time. I hope I didn't go too far over. I'm going to offer to open it up for questions if we have the ability. If not, I'm happy to hand it over. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you for the session. So do we have anyone with questions? I know tomorrow Sohan will be on ground to present. I'm just going to bring him on. He'll be doing hands-on on FLINT AI to see how to demonstrate to us how it can be used. I know at our earlier session today, a few of you have asked if you could do grading or assess students using AI. And I think FLINT, and I told you about the fact that you could actually set your rubrics and set instructions on how you want the AI to assess the students, which you could actually see on the screenshot where you see some grade awarded to the students. So FLINT also does that for you. And I think it will be a good time to join in the session tomorrow. It's going to be the last session of tomorrow, also same time. So I look forward to that time. It will be a walkthrough of FLINT AI. I use it also, and maybe one of my sessions tomorrow, I can show you some of the things that's been done. One unique thing about FLINT is also the fact that you could do calculation. A lot of AI platforms are still lagging behind in that, but you could use this for science, for maths, and do complex calculations. I've seen science teachers do that at my campus. So I want to say thank you to Sohan and thank you to Kevin and Elizabeth. It was good having you guys around, and I'm happy that you guys had time to make it to us to have this session with everyone. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. I think you can leave now if you so wish. We're also about rounding up for today. Thank you. And then Sohan, I'll see you tomorrow, right?
Of course, yeah. See you tomorrow. And great presentation,
Kevin.
Kevin. If you're still there.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks.